School of Law, and the Dean, Michael Waterstone, who's unfortunately not able to be here today, but is very excited about the event. I am the law school's Vice Dean for Faculty and Intellectual Life, and more importantly for today's purposes, I have the pleasure of being one of the faculty co-directors of the Institute of Technology, Law, and Policy. And that's ITLP is the sponsor of today's event. So thank you for coming. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge the native people on whose land UCLA sits. As a land-grant institution, UCLA and the law school acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. We pay our respects to our ancestors, elders, relatives, past, present, and emerging. Today's event deals with a topic that's everywhere in the news these days. It's about the rapid rise of artificial intelligence and the questions about how we govern it. We at UCLA Law are really fortunate to be the home of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy that I mentioned, which is doing lots of terrific work on the cutting edge of technology, law, and policy generally, and specifically on matters relating to artificial intelligence. So today we're really lucky to have with us U.S. Representative Ted Lieu, who's going to be talking about that issue and about giving us an inside look into how our leaders in Washington are approaching it. Congressman Lieu, thank you for joining us today on this important topic. Congressman Lieu is our representative in the nation's capital. His district includes many of LA's West Side and South Bay neighborhoods, including the UCLA campus. He's a longtime friend of UCLA and the law school, and he visits frequently to discuss all the big things that they're contending with in Washington, D.C. We were honored to have him a few years ago as our commencement speaker, I think virtually at that point, so we're great to have him here in person. It's going to be hard to give a snapshot biography with someone with a long list of accomplishments that Congressman Lieu has, but I'm going to give it a shot. Born in Taiwan and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, where I just learned he was a Cleveland Cavaliers fan. That was particularly fun for me because we were just sharing the experience that my growing up outside of Chicago was the Bulls beating the Cavaliers all the time. And that was also his experience of it too, although we had different valence for us. Congressman Lieu earned degrees in computer science and political science at Stanford, and then he received his JD magna cum laude at the Georgetown University Law Center, where he was editor-in-chief of the Georgetown Law Journal. Congressman Lieu clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, served in active duty in the Judge Advocate General Corps in the Air Force, and earned several medals for his service. Then he worked as a litigator at the firm of Munger, Tolles & Olson, as a lawyer in the legal office of UBS Financial Services, as an environmental quality commissioner in Torrance, California, and as a member of the Torrance City Council. He was elected to the California State Assembly in 2005, the California State Senate in 2011, and the U.S. House of Representatives in 2014. All along, he's been a prominent voice on many of the issues that affect us most, issues ranging from climate change to discrimination to national security and cybersecurity. Representative Lieu. Oh. Very dramatic. Very dramatic. There we go. Representative Lieu is going to be speaking today with Michael Karanikolas, who is the executive director of ITLP, which is, maybe I mentioned at the beginning, is a joint endeavor between the law school and the Samuel Lee School of Engineering. We're really lucky to have Michael as the leader of ITLP, where he runs our institute while also serving as an affiliated fellow with the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Before Michael came to UCLA, he was a Wikimedia Fellow at Yale Law, where he led the initiative on intermediaries and information. So again, thanks for everybody for coming. Over to you, Michael. I think Congressman Lieu has some introductory remarks. Yes. Oh, thank you.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon. I'm going to be on Capitol Hill next week, so let me just first say what a thrill it is to be able to stand in front of normal, rational people. So I'm going to give you some thoughts about how I view AI as a lawmaker, and then answer moderate questions and any questions that you may have. I do want to first thank UCLA for hosting this event. I'm glad they called it a TED Talk. Originally I was trying to do a TED Talk, and they said that was copyrighted. I'd be violating all sorts of stuff, so I'm going to do a TED Talk. And I want to thank Mark McKenna for his leadership, as well as Michael Karanikolas for his leadership. Thank you. And I also have here my former staff member, Ashley Famigo Dominguez, who is the Director of Federal Relations for UCLA, and very honored to have Associate Vice Chancellor Jennifer Pulakidas here as well. So I'll give you my view, how lawmakers, I think, should view AI. And to me, the best analogy is to think of two bodies of water. You've got a very large ocean of AI, and then you've got this small lake. So in this large ocean of AI is all the AI that we don't care about. So for example, your smart toaster has a preference for wheat toast over bagels. We don't care about that. Now in this small lake of AI is the AI we might want to care about. And to me, there's three buckets. The first is going to be AI that can destroy the world. So the Department of Defense has what are known as automated weapons, autonomous weapons that launch automatically. I've introduced bipartisan legislation that basically says no matter how amazing AI gets, we're never going to let it launch a nuclear weapon by itself. There always has to be a human in the loop. Later this month, there's going to be a movie coming out. I just saw a preview for it called The Creator. It starts off with AI launching a nuclear weapon in Los Angeles. So there's some other sorts of things that AI can do that could kill a lot of people and potentially destroy the world. The other issue will be bioweapons. So with generative AI and these large language models, there's been some famous trials and experiments where they basically asked it essentially tell us how to build a virus that can cause a pandemic and kill a lot of people. And it got pretty close to doing that, and pretty good at doing that, walking people through the steps of how they would actually do it. So we're looking at that issue as well. How do we make sure that these large language models don't let non-state actors go ahead and create the next pandemic? The difference between, for example, a virus and let's say a chemical weapon is viruses are actually not that hard to make. There's a certain protocol you follow, a certain number of steps you follow. There are all these companies that literally you tell them, hey, send me, this sample. You tell them what you want, and you get a vial. You can right now, I can get a vial if you want of the virus that caused the 1918 flu pandemic, and it will just send it to you. So, well, they shouldn't just send it to you. They should do checks on you before they send it to you. But who knows? So, so that's one bucket, right, where AI that can sort of destroy the world. The second bucket would be AI that isn't going to destroy the world, but can kill you individually. If your cell phone or laptop malfunctions, it's not going 40 miles per hour. If AI and automated vehicle malfunctions, it can kill you. It has killed people. It will kill people. There's a lot of AI moving objects, right? Planes, trains, automobiles. And so I think we need to have more regulators at both the state and federal level who are more attuned to unique aspects of AI. And then the last bucket is the hardest. It's basically AI that can cause harm to society or to individuals that isn't going to kill them. So for example, there are AI algorithms that are used in employment hiring. It could have biases. Maybe it has biases towards certain races or gender and so on. And if you don't know a company is using an AI algorithm to make decisions, you don't even know to sue if you don't get a job. There are AI algorithms that are involved in assessing credit risks. Well, that could redline certain groups or communities, could have an effect on people of color and so on. So that is something that's hard and difficult to address because it's so ubiquitous and in such a large category. And then within that sort of last bucket is also AI and sort of the intellectual property area. How do you monetize this? When you have a large AI language model that trains itself on the entire internet, well, guess what's on the entire internet? Copyrighted works of Taylor Swift. So do these large language models have to compensate her? Well, I don't know. So let's say they train on this internet and it has Taylor Swift copyrighted works, and then they generate lyrics that are like Taylor Swift lyrics. Do they have to compensate her? Let's say they, in addition to generating lyrics, they also put out a voice that sounds incredibly like Taylor Swift and match it to her lyrics. Do they have to compensate? I don't know. And we had this interesting IP subcommittee hearing. I'm on the distribution committee, and we had this hearing early this year where a former general counsel of the Copyright Office basically said, no, 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 to all those questions that I asked. She does not get compensation because he believes it's all fair use. And then 2 weeks later, we get a letter from another former general counsel of the Copyright Office saying, oh, he's all wrong. So there was a split within the legal community on that issue. So it's raising a lot of issues, this new generative AI. And if we were to say, oh, let's regulate AI next week, I don't even know what we would be regulating. It's moving so fast, developing so quickly. So my view is we should have some experts advise Congress. So I've introduced 5 bars of legislation to create a national blue ribbon AI commission that will make recommendations as to what kinds of AI we might want to regulate and how we might want to go about doing so. There's precedence for this. In the DoD military side, there was an AI commission that made some pretty good recommendations. The government and other folks took some of those recommendations. This is on the civilian side. So with that, happy to answer moderate questions, any questions you may have, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thanks as well for your work in bringing legislative attention to these issues, which I think are absolutely critical on public policy questions. Just as a note at the outset, you will all see little pencils and cue cards in front of you. If you would like to submit a question during the Q&A, please write something out and then hold it up, and one of our fantastic research assistants will pick that up and deliver that to the front. I want to start, if I can, by discussing your proposed National AI Commission Act. I think it's a very important initiative. I think that legislative attention in this space is important, but it's not the only initiative at the federal level, it's not the only initiative that's going to be studying these questions. So I wanted to start just by asking how you envision the proposed commission interacting with other bodies in the space, particularly the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, and whether you see that as a collaborative process or whether you see sort of any overlap in mandates.
So that's a great question. So the purpose of this commission is directed at Congress. The prior commission, which was done before sort of generative AI came on the scene, it's the Department of Commerce working with other agencies creating this advisory AI commission that advises the president. And so the president can do a lot of things through executive orders. The agencies can do a lot of things. And it would be a collaborative process. But I do think there's a difference between, what would the president do with an executive order versus what kind of regulatory framework would Congress set up, or what kind of actual laws need to be passed to mitigate the risks of AI. So those would be some of the differences. They're sort of focused on 2 different institutions. And in addition, when you look at the bill we wrote, it's also charged with looking at what is already out there, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. So for example, in the executive branch, NIST has done a pretty good job coming out with a risk framework for AI. And since most people seem to be looking at it going, this is pretty good, well, we don't have to recreate that. We can just sort of borrow it and use it and build upon it. So I have recently written a letter with some other members of Congress asking the Biden administration, saying, hey, your agency NIST came up with this really good risk management framework. Why don't you mandate all of your agencies now to actually follow it? And so I do envision these 2 commissions work together, but part of our commission is also to look at what's already out there so we don't recreate the wheel.
It's interesting you mentioned recreating the wheel, because the other elephant in the room in terms of AI regulation is the EU's AI Act, which is probably the most prominent model that's probably going to pass either later this year or early next year. Would you see that as a potential model to follow? Do you think that that's like how do you see the interplay between different legislative strategies that are taking shape?
So legislators do something that none of you should do in law school. We plagiarize. And so what we'll do is we'll look at different jurisdictions and we'll say, oh, look, they did X. How did that work out? If it worked out well, we'll copy X. If it didn't work out well, we're not going to do it. Or if it sort of worked out semi-well, we might say, let's do X plus Y, or X minus Z, or whatever it is. So I think it's good that other jurisdictions are going forward with regulations on AI. And then another reason for this commission is, it's not to delay legislation, but it does give some time to see what's happening. And we could review what Europe does, and if it's a disaster, well, we're not going to do it. But if it turns out to be pretty good, then we might take parts of it. I think it's too early to know exactly how it's going to shake out.
And there's one specific aspect of the EU legislation which seems to be gaining significant momentum, and that is what might be termed a risk-based approach to regulating AI. And your bill specifically calls for the Commission to examine risk-based approaches. And I wanted to ask why that choice was made. And just to frame the question a bit, the EU approach, the EU's AI Act is generally framed as a risk-based approach. One of the criticisms of that approach has been that it allows too much discretion to companies in order to assess, to do their own self-assessments, impact assessments of the potential harms of these models to demonstrate the degree of precautions that need to be taken. I thought it was interesting that you framed your talk with these different buckets. I wonder if that's related. I wonder what underlay your choice between selecting or directing the Commission towards a risk-based model, and whether you see any room for a rights-based approach as well, which tends to emphasize, tends to place more of an emphasis on sort of red lines and prohibitions.
So that's an interesting question. The way I view it is, and the reason we sort of took the risk-based approach is, my view is the entire legal system is essentially based on a rights-based approach, right? And what we want is to have AI not violate those rights. So my view is we should assess what is the risk of whatever AI algorithm it is violating the rights that we have. I think it's harder to sort of put in a rights sort of based approach to AI algorithms, partly because if they're moving so quickly, you're not even sort of exactly sure how it develops, next month, next year, or so on. And so, if you sort of write things into law saying you have certain rights vis-a-vis AI, it's not clear to me, well, why would you stop at AI? Why not anything else that could violate these particular rights? So my view is we already have a pretty good legal structure with rights that we think shouldn't be violated, and if they are, how you get compensated and so on. What we're trying to do is to get AI to not violate those rights.
And I guess on a similar question, you mentioned the expansion of interest in AI over the past year. There's also been a number of regulatory initiatives at the state level. I think I read today that there's 25 different states that have either passed or are considering AI legislation. How do you see the interplay between these different levels of regulation? Is there a danger towards different regulatory standards? Is this necessary given the diversity and range of impacts of AI?
It'd be hard for a company, right, to deal with 50 different state regulations on AI. I'm not sure how they would even do that. So I think what's going to end up happening is if a small state does something, that AI company might either just ignore it or not do something in that state. Versus if California does something, it'd be a little different. So California, for example, came out with a pretty strong privacy standard that then caused a number of companies to adhere to it. So California is a little different. It can do certain things that could cause the private sector to go a certain way because of how large we are. We're the 5th or 4th largest economy in the world. So California's sort of a little different, but most of the time you can't really have 50 different state standards. Not only in AI, but in a lot of technology. So, for example, I actually have a law, I'm sorry, not a law, a bill that I would love to have a law. Because what you saw were different states going out saying, we're either going to allow government to basically, for example, make Apple give up its contents on the iPhone or not. And my view is Apple can't really deal with 50 different standards like that, and it's got to be sort of a national standard. Without saying what the national standard is, well, it's more of a preemption issue. So in a lot of technology, I do think it's very hard to have all these different states do different regulations. I don't know how a company would comply.
I note that your proposed bill is bipartisan, and I'm curious as to whether you see a partisan divide on these issues, or in how harms or risks related to AI are understood. I guess it's early days, but I mean, we've seen a partisan divide emerge with other technologies. Content moderation is the one that leaps out, where you have bipartisan agreement that there's a problem, but diametrically opposed views, not only of the solution, but of how the problems manifest. So I'm curious as to how the partisan dynamic seems to be evolving within this space.
The best way to think of AI is that it's not a human being, it's not sentient, it's a tool. And a tool can be used for both good and bad purposes, and to me, tools are not particularly partisan. If you look at Congress, in terms of technology, it's more of a bipartisan issue. I've worked on various bills related to cybersecurity that have been signed into law, because there's no such thing as a Republican cybersecurity defense or a Democratic cybersecurity offense. It's just cybersecurity. And right now, AI seems to be more like that. A number of my bills I've introduced are bipartisan. Now, it's interesting you bring up content moderation. I don't know if that's a disagreement on technology. I think that's just a flat-out disagreement on content, and also on basic facts. So I'm not. But what it does point to is, I think both Democrats and Republicans, not just legislators, but the American public in general, are not particularly happy with how social media turned out. And I think that's one of the reasons I see more people interested in AI, because they don't want to repeat sort of how social media turned out. I think they want to be able to try to mitigate the risks before they become sort of full-blown problems.
But I'm curious, so, I can see ways that the issue can be framed which should be bipartisan, right? So the national security questions. I would assume that Republicans and Democrats are in agreement that nobody wants to see, I was about to say nobody wants to see Los Angeles hit by a nuclear weapon, but maybe that's not a great example. But nobody wants to see random nuclear strikes in the United States, fine. I could see aspects of this issue as it's sliced out. So, say related to discrimination and fairness, right? Which is a core concern with implementation of these technologies related to access and credit, related to housing, right? Are there aspects that break down in a partisan way, or do you see that consensus holding as these debates move forward?
My honest answer is I have no idea. I don't know, and partly it's because we're just at sort of early stages right now of getting legislators to focus on this issue. When we go back next week, the first thing we're going to do is try to prevent a government shutdown. Right? And that's where we are. Right? We're trying to prevent stupid stuff from happening to the country. So most legislators don't walk around thinking about technology, let alone AI. My colleagues elected me to House leadership as vice chair of the Democratic caucus earlier this year. So I worked with the Republican vice chair, and we brought in Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, and they created ChatGPT. And we had this presentation by Mr. Altman. I think there were over 60 members of Congress, bipartisan. And what was fascinating, sort of during the questions and answers, is it was clear to me that some members of Congress had thought about this issue very deeply. Some members of Congress had never seen ChatGPT before. And so there was this just wide sort of gulf in sort of just basic knowledge. I think that's the same across America. So I think the first thing we have to do is just get people up to speed on what AI is, what it isn't, what it might be able to do, what it probably shouldn't do. and at least just have a basic baseline to operate from. And then we can proceed. So I just think it's really early to know if at some point the partisan consensus starts working down.
I guess on a similar note in terms of the dynamics, so you have a computer science degree. I was interested to see, I was interested if you'd be comfortable sharing the degree to which that does impact your discussions with your colleagues, and the fact that you potentially have more of a specialized background on this stuff. The degree to which that's helpful. I mean, presumably everybody in Congress has access to experts. They all have staff, they all have researchers. So everybody has access to research on this stuff if they want to. But I'm curious as to, especially as an interdisciplinary institute, I'm curious as to the degree to which that dynamic influences your engagement with your colleagues, or the degree to which it's proven helpful in debating questions that are related to technically sophisticated products.
So let me give you a little sense of what it's like to be a member of Congress. We're in 2-year legislative cycles. Every 2 years, I vote over 1,000 times on the floor in committees. And most of the time, those are on issues of which I am not an expert. So, for example, what I tell people, so I have this amazing, beautiful district, right? I've got UCLA, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, West LA, goes south through the beach cities, to Palos Verdes. And what I tell people is the only agriculture I have in my district are the gardens on the rooftops of hotels. But I'm going to vote on an Agriculture Reauthorization Act this year, as are every member of Congress. And you don't have to be a farmer or someone in the agriculture industry to vote on that. It is helpful, right, to do some basic reading and look at what your staff tells you, look what other groups tell you. But as members of Congress, we vote on all sorts of stuff all the time for which we're not experts. I don't know, honestly, how a Boeing 787 flies. I vote on FAA reauthorization, right? And so you don't have to be a computer science major to vote on AI-related bills. It'd be helpful, though, to at least know, well, what is the point of this bill? What's the objective this bill is trying to seek? And what are some harms that AI algorithms could cause? And what are some benefits it could cause? So as long as you sort of, I think, have understanding the principles of the bill and the issues, then you can vote on it. And now in terms of, is it easier for me to look at different AI bills and sort of get a sense of what's going on? I think it's probably easier, and it's easier for me to look at bills and sort of know if they're going to be stupid or not in terms of how they're going to be executed, because there's just some things you can't do in technology, and I mean, it's not magic, right? But you do have to sort of have some realistic expectations of what a law can actually do in terms of getting technology to do X, Y, and Z. So, I think it's helpful, but I do think anyone can participate in an AI discussion whether or not you have a technical degree.
But if you're the only person in the room with a computer science degree, which I assume happens a lot, you're surrounded by people with either a pure legal education or whatever. I mean, do you think that does that assist you in making your point, or is it just, well, we're all just going on the same research that we have?
Sure. Well, so I'm going to tell you a story, and then you can think for yourself whether it's helpful or not at computer science. So one of the reasons that I immediately, very quickly put out a bill, basically saying we cannot let AI ever control a nuclear weapon, is sort of my knowledge, right, of how these AI systems work. So when I was getting my computer science degree, we had these folks working on neural networks, and we largely ignored them. We thought, oh, it's never going to work. They were crazy as pie in the sky, because they were saying, we're going to make AI think like a human being. And then 10, 15 years ago, it started working. And that's why all of a sudden voice recognition is pretty amazing. Right? You calling an airline, and no matter what accent you have or how you store your words, it magically understands what flight you want to book. Facial recognition is pretty amazing. Computers can recognize faces better than human beings can. Unfortunately, that state of technology right now does discriminate against people with darker skin. So I do think that there should be guardrails put on there. I have legislation on that. Because my view is you deploy facial recognition technology across America at all these law enforcement agencies, it's just one huge sort of equal protection violation because minorities will be discriminated and misidentified at high rates. And the way that these neural networks work, the way generative AI works, these large language models, is it starts out, imagine sort of, so a TV screen, when you see TV and you see a picture, what a computer sees is thousands of little pixels. And so at the beginning, you have all these pixels, and they're assigned a random number, a random weight. And then you imagine grids of these pixels. And you feed this algorithm a picture of a cat. And the algorithm says, that's not a cat. And you're like, you're wrong. And the algorithm changes some numbers. And then you give another picture of a cat. And it says, that's not a cat. You go, oh, you're wrong again. And then the algorithm changes some more numbers. And then you give it a picture of a cat and says, that's a cat. You go, yeah, you got it right. So it changes some more numbers. You do this a million times. And then the algorithm figures out what's a cat and what's not a cat. What we don't know is how does it go from point A to the conclusion. We can't trace it. We just know it gets it right, as far as we can tell, virtually all the time. And the word virtual is important because, again, we don't actually know what it's doing. So there's this famous example of these researchers, they're trying to figure out, can we use AI to detect tuberculosis from X-ray scans? And when they were doing it and doing the algorithm and testing it, it was going fantastically well. And then they deployed it and it totally failed. And then when they went and started doing auditing and figured out what was happening, they realized what the algorithm was detecting was a scan that was given from a newer X-ray machine or an older X-ray machine, because people in Western countries didn't really get tuberculosis, and we had newer X-ray scans. Folks in non-developed countries tend to have more tuberculosis, there are older X-ray machines, and so that was a pattern this AI algorithm was detecting. But the researchers had no idea, because again, we can't trace it. We don't actually know what this AI is actually doing. And so to me, an AI controlling a nuclear weapon could be correct 99.9999% of the time. But there might be this weird scenario where it goes absolutely bonkers, right? And so that's why I think maybe having a computer science degree sometimes helps.
Yeah, the tuberculosis challenge is an interesting one. There was a similar story I saw where AI was able to identify cancerous growths, was being trained to identify cancerous growths, and it quickly identified that if there's a ruler next to it, it's cancerous, because that's how it appears in medical textbooks. So, we've done a lot of work here related to how AI is going to change the practice of law, which I think is very relevant to the folks in the room. How lawyers' jobs are going to be different. And in preparing for this, I wondered how you see AI potentially impacting the work of Congress, or changing the way the legislative process functions. And obviously, it's a tremendous research tool when it's accurate. It's a tremendous writing tool potentially. So I would be interested in your thoughts on that.
So first of all, I have my amazing staff here. Aurelia is here, and Daniela from our DC office. And I basically told my staff they can do whatever they want with AI. They can use it, they don't have to use it, but at the end of the day, it's their work product. And so if they do well, I'll reward them. If they don't do well, I'll tell them don't do that again. So I don't really have any hard and fast rules for my staff. I encourage them to experiment, and if they find that using AI helps them, then great. But you inserted something very interesting in your question. You said when it's accurate, right? And generative AI and large language models at this point in time are not designed to seek the truth. And that's very important, both in law and in fields like medicine. The way generative AI works is it tries to figure out, based on your query or your prompt, what's the first word that might answer that well, and then what's the next word that attaches to the first word. And it can it craft a pleasing sentence that answers your query, and then a pleasing paragraph. And so generative AI is very good at writing very good sounding sentences and paragraphs. They can be completely wrong. And there's a very technical term for this. It's called hallucination. And they don't know how to stop it right now. And I think it's endemic to technology. And so you may have read about this interesting article where some lawyer basically submitted a document to the court written by generative AI, and he didn't double check it. And basically all the case names were fake. Because generative AI realized that, oh, this is what these documents look like, and there are these things that look like case names. So just randomly inserted things that look like case names. And there was no known cases for any of the things that were cited in this document. And that's because it's not trying to seek out the truth. It's trying to sort of generate something based on patterns that's detected in the past, which is very problematic, right, in the medical field. Let's say you try and use AI to help note-taking or whatever it is for a doctor. Well, that's great, but you still need someone to review it because you can't like mess up the name, right, of a drug or a dosage amount or something else that could harm a patient. And right, in medicine, you can't sort of have things where you're depending on life or death, have AI that's sort of generally accurate, right? That doesn't work. And so I think we have to be careful in how we use generative AI, at least at this stage of the technology. Now, if you took these large language models and said, all we're going to do is train it on, let's say, specific data from the Cleveland Clinic on a specific disease for a specific reason, it probably can get pretty close to ascertaining the truth, right? But still, it's not its goal. The AI algorithm, that's not the goal of the AI algorithm. It's the goal of the AI algorithm is to sort of try to figure out past patterns and then place a new thing based on its understanding of past patterns.
So I'm hearing that you're not worried that it's going to replace your job anytime soon.
It's not going to replace jobs where there's a bunch of human interaction. So I'll give you an interesting example. There's this Hollywood strike, right, that we're all very aware of. One of the issues is AI in terms of content generation, in terms of writing scripts for movies or TV, right, affects writers. Content generation, AI can also do videos that look just like Tom Cruise, voices that sound just like Ben Affleck, or do complete. I saw this complete trailer for a movie that was done by generative AI. Person did like 7 hours. It was a 30-second trailer. It normally would take way longer than that. And you can do Taylor Swift voices in there and so on. The Directors Guild, do you know why they settled, how they were settled so quickly? Because directors, are just not going to be replaced anytime soon. You're not going to have a robot over there, right? Robot technology is still quite a ways away, so directors knew their jobs were safe. So they basically said, hey, this AI issue, we're just going to deal with it in the next round. So they settled. But some people have to deal with it right now, and that's why I think you're seeing this strike in that field. So anything that sort of has a bunch of human interaction, I think is going to be fine for a while. But if you're a radiologist, I don't know. I probably wouldn't recommend you go in that field, or anything where there's not a lot of human.
This is why we're doing it at the law school. It's full of human interaction. So just a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Again, folks, if you have a question, please raise it up high, and our RAs will come around and connect and collect it, see a few. In terms of pressing concerns, one concern that has largely flown under the radar in government discussions of AI, and I think this is probably true in the US, I think it's certainly true in the EU, relates to its transnational impacts, including and particularly in the global south. And there are particular kinds of impacts from AI, both related to environmental impacts in terms of the power generation or the extractive industries that are required in order to support this expansion in computing power. Human rights impacts, where you have a particular technology that's dual use and it can be completely innocuous, or if not innocuous, then at least relatively safe if used in a context, but exported to Zimbabwe and it's used in a completely different way. I feel like that's potentially a challenge for legislators, because your focus, rightly, is meant to be on your constituents. And so, you know, but at the same time, these are technologies that don't really know national boundaries. And legislative standards that get set in the EU or in the US can influence how legislation evolves around the world. So I guess I wanted to ask, you know, should Congress be thinking about these challenges in a transnational way, how they're manifesting in the global south, or should the focus be you know, here in the US?
So answer that in two ways. One is, there are things that we should do regardless of what other nations do or don't do. So if Russia is going to let AI control its nuclear weapons, that would be horrible, but I would still say the US, we're just not going to let that happen. Right? So I think, to me, there's a sort of class of laws and regulations that we should just do, because it's the right thing to do. And then there are laws and regulations that maybe we might not want to do because they'll hurt our innovation or competitiveness if we don't get other countries to follow. Now, the second thing I'm going to say is, it also turns out that much of what you're seeing in sort of the large language models and generative AI is going to come from the Western countries for the foreseeable future because of how expensive it is to do this. To basically have a large language model like ChatGPT, their power use is so immense, you can see it from space. They basically string together 25,000 incredibly expensive NVIDIA chips. And just the infrastructure to operate this. There was an interesting article that came out, I think it was Washington Post, that basically says they pretty much lose money every day because of the power usage that they have to just answer people's queries from around the world. And so the interesting question was, would they ever make money? I don't know, but as of right now, they use so much power and they have such a big infrastructure that only a few countries and companies can replicate this. So Google could do that, Microsoft can do that, Meta can do that, but Zimbabwe is not going to do that. They don't have the capability to do it, and so that's why I think much of the regulation is still going to be in the Western, sort of in the United States or the EU, just because at scale right now, we're really the only places that can do these large language models.
And I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, the location where this research is being done. I've heard it also said that one of the reasons why the EU is able to get out ahead of this stuff, one of the advantages, I guess, on the regulatory side that the EU has, is that the domestic industries aren't as strong. So it's much easier to regulate companies that are based elsewhere than it is when you're talking about your own kind of national champions.
That's absolutely correct, and they don't have the filibuster.
Can I ask maybe just one more question before we go over to the audience ones? So quite a bit earlier you mentioned unhappiness with how social media has turned out. You know, I wonder if there's a broader question about ethics and social responsibility in engineering and computer science in the technical fields. And it's a little bit self-interested because we're working quite a bit in this space in the engineering school to try to build a better curriculum around social responsibility. But you know, drawing on your experiences both in regulating these technologies and your own educational background, do you think that there's more to be done in order to ensure that, you know, computer science or engineering graduates leave school with a broader understanding of their social impacts? Should we be doing more on that front?
Yes, I don't think you could really ever do enough on that front. It's a very interesting question. I remember I was recently talking to an MIT professor who specialized in basically biological sciences, and it was interesting. He said something very interesting. He said, you know, all his colleagues and the people in the field, he's like, they're like, well, why would anyone make a bad virus? Right? Like, why would they, you know, make a virus to spread as fast as it could? Because all his colleagues were like looking at, you know, trying to do medical breakthroughs and help humanity, this, that, and it was just an interesting view that that he sort of has to tell them that, look, you know, with generative AI and this or that, you could cause a pandemic, and to get them to sort of think badly, think about bad things. And I actually think it'd be helpful if we got more people to think about what would like a criminal do? Or what would a hacker do? What would a non-state terrorist do? There's not much we can do about state actors in the movie, but my concern is, let's not make it that easy for a non-state actor to create a violation. Right? And in terms of AI and sort of your normal day-to-day activities, I think it's helpful to make sure anyone who's, actually all of the American public to understand that AI does have biases. It does have biases based on its training data, based on not only how it was trained, but also just inherent in the way the technology is, things that it can and can't do, and how it may be detecting patterns that you're not aware of that could be totally irrelevant, right? Like the ruler next to a tumor, for example. So I think it's just helpful to let people know about the potential biases in technology and then try to mitigate against that.
So we have some fantastic questions in. For folks, if you still have more questions, please write them out. I'm going to start with one. Actually, I had a note about this as well. You mentioned that we already have good laws on rights, suggesting that you would rely on existing laws on the books, at least in part, and that AI's effect on different sectors can be on the regulatory target. Another approach is to regulate AI across sectors. How do you think? How do you feel about general versus sectoral approaches to AI regulation?
That's a great question, and it's one reason I introduced this National AI Commission, though I do think it'd be helpful if we had people far smarter than me think about this and to really do a deep dive into how prior regulatory approaches have worked or failed. So I'll give you an example. The bill I was talking about to regulate facial recognition technology that I introduced, it took me over 2 years working with stakeholders to have a bill that made sense. We worked with civil rights groups, law enforcement groups, and so on. It's very clear to me Congress does not have the capacity or bandwidth to be able to pass a law on every single application of AI that could possibly cause harm. But there's a model for this, right? So we don't pass individual laws approving or disapproving specific drugs. The FDA does that, right? And we create a whole regulatory system where we have regulators make certain decisions, and there's advantages to that. One is if a regulator makes a mistake, they don't need another act of Congress to correct it. They can correct it pretty quickly. And regulators can devote, every day thinking and working on these specific issues where the legislatures, we just don't do that. So I would think that a regulatory approach would be better in terms of having some sort of agency do this. Now, whether it's sort of one agency or we empower 7 different agencies to do more in their field, I'm sort of agnostic on that. So I'd like to see more ideas or more reasons why we would go one way or the other.
So this is a really interesting question based on the notion of the black box problem, the issue of not being able to identify how AI gets from point A to point B. The proposed legislation you've so far discussed seems to be preventing AI from making decisions that can be catastrophic because, or at least partly because of this black box problem. Do you foresee legislation or regulation that addresses the black box problem itself?
So I've thought about that. I don't know how you would address the black box problem other than to have a human in the loop, because I don't think you can fix this technology. It's the way it works. And maybe we can figure out a way to trace it one day, but I'm not sure we ever can. And to me, it's just sort of like, that's a reality. And you just have to deal with what the reality is and then figure out ways to try to harness the benefits and mitigate the harms.
Do you think that it's helpful to frame the problem depending on use cases? Because I think you mentioned a toaster early on, and I don't really care if the toaster has good reasoning or bad reasoning in telling me how I like my toast. But there are certain categories of decision making where the black box is more problematic than others, right? Where we demand more accountability, right? Certainly any kind of government decision making, right? If I'm being denied a service by the government or a benefit, then the why becomes very important. So, is it useful to think, sectorally about the use cases or about who's doing the decision making or what in framing that challenge?
Yes, so that makes a lot of sense. So one way to do this is through disclosure. You could say, look, if a company's going to use a hiring algorithm, we're going to make it disclose to applicants that it's using an AI hiring algorithm. So that if it turns out that this hiring algorithm was biased, an applicant would sue them. Because if the applicant didn't know that this company used an AI algorithm that could be biased, they wouldn't even know how to sue on it, right? So I do think disclosure could be helpful. I think a lot of this is going to just take some time to play out through not only the courts, but also in various sectors. And maybe it's a huge problem. Maybe there's all sorts of AI hiring algorithms that are quite biased. Maybe it's not a problem. Maybe these AI companies are pretty good at figuring out, well, we get this bias, so we're going to correct it. So the other thing I want to say is, it is totally possible that all 57 bad harms from generative AI come true. Also possible that none of them come true, or maybe 3 of them come true, and there's one we never even thought of. And again, I think that's why it might be helpful to take some time to just sort of assess where AI is going before we sort of drop a congressional law. Because if you make a mistake, you know the act of Congress to correct it.
So there's 3 specific harms. These are all great questions. I wish I had asked folks to put their names on it, and I could shout out who's coming up with these great questions. This one is about 3 specific challenges that you see related to AI, and I'll leave it to you if you want to address one or more of them. One is related to racial and gender discrimination. One is related to defamation. And the third is related to false advertising or consumer deception. Are these specific harms that you've thought about in any way, and are there things that we should be thinking about to help prevent these problems?
So on the first one of the things I want to do, so I think it was good we brought in Sam Altman to sort of tell us about ChatGPT and his view of technology. He also has a particular viewpoint, so I thought it was important to bring in folks from civil society who had other viewpoints, who talk about the risks of gender and racial discrimination. So I did an entire briefing where we brought in 4 different folks who did talk about the risks of AI in terms of race and gender and so on. And there are different ways you can try to deal with this, right? One is you could do a disclosure system where you sort of make a company disclose it, and then you let the law kick in and do what the law does in terms of gender, racial discrimination, and height. Another way is you could say, you know what, we're going to set certain requirements based on the actual data you can use to train your AI algorithm, or we're going to audit your algorithm, right? So that's sort of a different model where you sort of, instead of sort of suing after the fact, you sort of go in and you prevent this program from actually being even deployed unless it meets certain standards. I don't know enough about that particular sector, that field of sort of AI in that particular sector, how it works, and whether that might be an approach you need because the algorithms are so lousy, or maybe they're really good. I don't know enough about that, but it is, I think, one reason I'm doing this commission. I think they should study that. I think it'd be helpful if we got more data on how it's actually working. In terms of defamation, it's sort of intriguing. So ChatGPT says all sorts of stuff that's just not true. It's not just ChatGPT, right? So Microsoft's Bing will do this, Google's Bard, they all use similar technology. And I think the companies legally can get away, sort of shield themselves pretty simply. They just put a little disclaimer saying this is like, for your personal use only. So, if it defames you, you're not going to do anything, right? But yeah, it will say false stuff about different folks. And the question is, could you sue on that, or what would damages be? So, and now, also, I think people also know that ChatGPT is an AI algorithm, and is it really harm if it puts out something about someone that says from ChatGPT? People are like, oh yeah, the AI algorithm is hallucinating, or So I'm not, I'd be open to sort of legal fixes and defamation. To me, that's not, to me, that's not yet a major harm. And then in terms of deception is going to be a problem. And so you've got AI algorithms right now that if you give it half an hour's worth of your voice, they'll sound sort of like you. If you give it like 2 hours worth of your voice, your family members will think it's exactly you. And so there's already these scams where people get a phone call from a family member who's in trouble and then asks for money to get wired. And it turns out it was actually an AI voice. So that's just going to happen, and I think it's going to be a period of learning where folks will get scammed and they go, okay, I'm not going to do that again. And to me, the best way is to just get people to understand there are these scams out there and to be a little more aware of weird phone calls they get, or just when they see videos, to at least sort of do a double check in their mind and go, okay, maybe that video is not accurate or not true. You remember, social media at the beginning, there are all these, right, the Nigerian email scam, like asking you to wire money and so on. Well, some people did that, but after a while, people sort of learn and go, okay, I think that's a scam, right? And I think there's going to be a period of learning with AI, but deception is a problem. AI is going to be very good at that. AI is going to be very good at knowing what triggers certain groups of people and then send messages to trigger those folks to think a certain way. Those are all problems, and to me, the best way is to try to inoculate people somewhat against it by just letting them know this could happen, and maybe the post they're reading is not from a human being, it might be from a chatbot operated by a criminal.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned perceptions of accuracy, which I think is key to the consumer deception. I think it's also key to the defamation question. Is if people are viewing these models as basically a magic 8-ball, nobody's going to accuse a magic 8-ball of defaming you because you say, did this person commit a particular crime? Yes, it did. But the perception is really important, and the perception of accuracy and reliability of these things. And I think we were chatting before we came down here about the idea that these language models are increasingly including little disclaimers at the bottom, saying, for legal purposes, this is a language model, it's just spitting out responses, you shouldn't take it too seriously. But the counter to that is the huge amount of hype that's behind these things.
Yeah.
So I notice it's a little bit, they'll put this tiny disclaimer at the bottom, but then there's this media blitz about how groundbreaking and incredible these models are. And that kind of counteracts, that certainly it seems to me that it would overpower for most people the impact of the tiny little fine print disclaimer at the bottom saying not to be taken seriously, this may be defamation, we don't know. So I guess the other way to approach this potentially is related to how these things are marketed, right? You mentioned education. Marketing is the other aspect of hyping it. And I don't know, if there's a regulatory role for that, because there's First Amendment implications. But that seems to be the other component, is managing the hype surrounding them.
Well, so it's interesting you say that. One of the things that Sam Altman said at this dinner was that he tries to go around and to de-hype ChatGPT, right? Sort of for the reasons you mentioned. And it is pretty remarkable, honestly, what it can do already. Right? And this is the second public release. Imagine, what does ChatGPT version 8 look like? I don't know. But it's probably going to be even better, right? So I don't want to take away from what it can do, which is generally pretty remarkable. And AI, generative AI and AI in other fields have done amazing things. So it used to be that someone would take 5 years getting a PhD writing about how you fold one human protein. AI has now folded every human protein known to humankind, given it to medical research. So there is some pretty amazing stuff AI has done, will continue to do. But it also does turn out that human communications is sort of easy to replicate at a base level, but beyond that, it's not that easy, right? There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of meanings and different things happening in communications, and then there is sort of truth, which, again, the models are just not designed right now to try to get to. They're trying to, or it's based on patterns.
So